If you don't move, we're both dead. The Navajo held her tight as the quicksand pulled them down. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's tale. The sun was already setting when she ventured out of the cabin, her mind heavy with the weight of uncertainty. Amelia had lived alone for over a year now, after the tragic death of her husband in a mining accident. Her home was perched on the edge of the wilderness, miles away from any town, surrounded by tall trees and the constant hum of the wind through the forest. It was a solitary life, but one she had grown used to. Yet, today was different. There had been whispers in the nearby town about outlaws roaming the area, and a sense of unease hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. She tried to push the thoughts aside as she made her way toward the creek, her feet crunching the dry leaves beneath her boots. The ground felt unusually soft, as if the earth was swallowing her with each step. But it wasn't until she heard the rustling noise behind her that her heart began to race. She turned, her pulse quickening, and saw nothing but the shifting shadows of the trees. Yet, something didn't feel right. Amelia quickened her pace, her eyes darting around as she walked, but the silence was oppressive. It wasn't until she reached the edge of the creek that she saw him. A figure standing tall, his dark silhouette framed by the fading light. His movements were calm, deliberate, as if he had been waiting for her. She froze, unsure whether to run or to call out. But then, as if sensing her fear, he stepped forward, and she saw his face. He was Navajo. His features were sharp and defined, his long black hair tied back in a simple braid. The look in his eyes was one of quiet intensity, yet there was something else. Something that softened the harshness of his expression. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Amelia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her throat was dry, her body stiff with tension. She could only nod. The man studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You're in danger." The words hit her like a slap. Amelia's mind raced as she tried to process what he meant. But before she could ask, the man stepped closer, his hand resting on her shoulder, guiding her toward the trees. "Come with me. Quickly," he said, urgency creeping into his voice. He moved with a purpose, and though she had no idea what was happening, Amelia found herself following his lead, her legs moving on their own. They walked deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around them, and the distant sound of rushing water growing louder. But it wasn't until they reached a small clearing that Amelia realized something was terribly wrong. The ground beneath her feet shifted. The earth seemed to open up, pulling at her boots as if it were alive. She gasped, her eyes widening in shock as she realized she was sinking into quicksand. Panic flooded her chest, and she tried to pull her foot free, but the more she struggled, the faster she was drawn in. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body shaking with fear. Just when she thought she would be swallowed whole, she felt a strong hand wrap around her wrist. "Don't move," the Navajo man commanded, his voice urgent yet calm. He pulled her closer, his other hand gripping her tightly as the quicksand continued to drag at her legs. "Hold on to me, and stay still. We're both dead if you don't." Amelia's heart hammered in her chest as she looked into his eyes, realizing just how close she was to death. But his presence was steadying, his grip unwavering. He was her only lifeline, and she had to trust him. With a sharp tug, he began to pull her out of the quicksand, his muscles straining with the effort. She could feel the pull of the earth beneath her, but somehow, with his help, she was rising, inch by inch. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the ground firmed beneath her, and she was free. She collapsed into his arms, gasping for air, her body trembling from the ordeal. The man held her tight, his voice low as he whispered, "You're safe now." Amelia couldn't find the words to thank him. She simply clung to him, overwhelmed by the sudden rush of emotions. In that moment, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer alone. Amelia's heart was still racing, the adrenaline from the quicksand escape coursing through her veins. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she looked up at the man who had saved her life. He didn't say a word, only tightened his grip around her, pulling her further into the shelter of the trees. The woods were dense here, and the air felt cooler, the shadows of the towering pines casting long fingers across the ground. Amelia could hear her heart pounding in her ears, still in shock from the terror she had just faced. The Navajo man moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the woods as if he could sense danger lurking just beyond the trees. His posture was tense, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring, ready for anything. Amelia felt a mixture of gratitude and confusion. She didn't know this man, and yet he had risked his life to save her. She had no idea where they were going, but something in the way he moved, the way he carried himself, told her he knew these woods better than anyone. "You should be safe now," he said, his voice low but steady. Amelia nodded, still too shaken to speak. The tension between them was thick, as if the very air around them was charged with something unspoken. She glanced around, taking in her surroundings. They were deep in the woods now, the creek far behind them, and the quiet was almost unsettling. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the occasional rustling of branches in the breeze. As they walked, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't just the woods that felt different, it was him. She had never felt so vulnerable, and yet so safe, all at once. It was as if his presence was a shield, a protection she had never known. "Who are you?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment, the man didn't answer. He simply kept walking, his eyes focused ahead, as if he were searching for something. Amelia felt her throat tighten with anticipation. But then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I am Navajo, and I protect the land." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Amelia didn't know what he meant by protect the land, but the intensity in his voice told her that it was something important, something sacred. They walked for what felt like hours, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow through the trees. Eventually, they arrived at a small clearing. In the center stood a modest shelter, made of logs and woven branches. It wasn't much, but it had an air of quiet strength about it. The man stopped in front of the shelter, turning to face Amelia. "You are safe here," he said, his voice calm. Amelia nodded again, but her mind was racing. Safe. She didn't even know his name, and yet he was offering her protection. She didn't know whether to trust him or not, but at this moment, he was her only lifeline. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The man simply nodded, as if it were no big deal. He turned and motioned for her to follow him inside the shelter. As they entered, the smell of smoke and wood filled the air. The fire was already burning in the center, casting flickering shadows on the walls. There was a small bed in the corner, made up with blankets, and a few other basic items scattered around. It wasn't much, but it was warm and welcoming in its simplicity. Amelia felt a strange sense of calm settle over her as she sat down by the fire. The man moved to the other side of the shelter, crouching by a small wooden chest. He opened it and pulled out a leather pouch, then stood and walked over to her. He handed her the pouch. "Eat," he said simply. Amelia took the pouch, untying the string and peering inside. Dried meat and berries. It wasn't much, but it would sustain her. She took a small bite, savoring the salty flavor, her stomach grumbling with hunger. As she ate, she glanced over at the man. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her curiosity getting the best of her. He didn't immediately answer. Instead, he took a deep breath, his gaze distant, as if lost in thought. "Because," he began, his voice softer now, "the land calls to me. And when I hear it, I must respond." Amelia didn't fully understand what he meant, but somehow, she felt it. The connection he had to this land, to the earth beneath their feet. There was a bond there, something ancient, something powerful. She had no idea what was coming next, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life had just changed forever. As the night settled around them, the fire crackling softly in the background, Amelia felt the weight of her past slowly begin to fade away. In its place was a new sense of purpose. She didn't know where this journey would lead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face whatever came next. Amelia awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside the shelter, the warmth of the fire still lingering in the small room. She had slept deeply, more peacefully than she had in months, despite the strangeness of her surroundings. The Navajo man had kept watch through the night, his stoic presence offering a sense of protection she had not realized she desperately needed. The fire was now low, its embers glowing softly in the center of the shelter. Amelia rubbed her eyes, her body still sore from the harrowing experience with the quicksand, but the fear that had consumed her the day before seemed distant now. She could still feel the grip of the man's hand pulling her free, the strength in his hold grounding her, but it was the calm in his eyes that had offered her the most comfort. He had never faltered, not once. She stretched, the quiet peace of the morning settling in, and when she turned to look at him, he was already preparing something by the fire. His movements were efficient, purposeful, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. Amelia's curiosity began to stir again. She had to know more about him, about why he had helped her. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked, breaking the silence between them. The man glanced up, his dark eyes locking with hers for just a moment before he spoke. "The land does not sleep. Neither do I," he replied. His words were simple, but they carried a weight. Amelia wasn't sure if he meant that literally or if it was just part of his way of life. "You live alone out here?" she asked, her voice softer now. He nodded. "The land provides all I need. I do not seek company." His response was not unkind, but it held the same quiet certainty that seemed to permeate everything about him. Amelia nodded, understanding that this man was not one to share much, but she couldn't help but feel a pang of loneliness for him. It must have been a life of solitude, one that few could understand. "How long have you been living this way?" she asked, trying to ease into a conversation. He paused, his hand stilling for just a moment as if he were weighing his words. "A long time," he finally said. "The land has always been my home." His answer was vague, but Amelia could tell it wasn't an answer he shared lightly. She was about to press further when he stood up abruptly, his gaze shifting toward the edge of the clearing. "There are others nearby," he said. Amelia froze, her heart skipping a beat. "Others? Who?" He held up a hand to silence her. "Not who you think." "Stay quiet," he whispered. Without another word, he moved swiftly to the edge of the shelter, peering into the trees beyond. Amelia's heart began to race again. Had they been found? Had the outlaws finally caught up with her? She felt a knot of fear tighten in her chest, but the man's calm demeanor kept her from panicking. She watched as he crouched low, his eyes scanning the woods. Moments later, he beckoned her over. "Come," he said, his voice steady. "Follow me." She didn't hesitate, moving quickly to his side. He motioned for her to stay low, his hand guiding her as they moved into the trees. She felt the weight of her breath on her chest, every step feeling like it echoed too loudly in the silence of the woods. As they moved further from the shelter, Amelia noticed the tension in the air. The man's movements were quick but deliberate, always with purpose, always alert. They reached a cluster of rocks where he stopped and motioned for her to crouch down. He crouched beside her, his eyes focused on something in the distance. Amelia followed his gaze, but she saw nothing. The forest was quiet, too quiet. She could feel her pulse racing in her throat. "What are we waiting for?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Patience," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "They are close." Amelia stayed still, her heart pounding in her ears, but she trusted him. She had no other choice. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of footsteps reached her ears. She looked at the man, her eyes wide with fear, but he only nodded. "Stay hidden. Do not move unless I say." His voice was calm, but it held an edge that told her this was serious. She nodded, her body tensing as the footsteps grew louder. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of what was to come. Finally, through the trees, figures began to appear. 3 men on horseback, their faces hidden beneath hoods and scarves. The man's hand tightened on the hilt of his knife, his posture shifting as he prepared for what might come next. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as the men passed just a few yards away. She could hear their voices now, low and murmuring, but she couldn't make out the words. The man beside her remained motionless, his body tense with readiness. As the men continued on, the Navajo warriors' eyes never left them. Amelia couldn't help but wonder who they were and why they were so close. Were they after her? Or was there something more to this land that she didn't yet understand? Whatever it was, she was now deeper in this world than she had ever been before, and there was no going back. The man stayed still until the last of the riders disappeared from view. Then, without a word, he stood and began to move toward the shelter again, his pace steady. Amelia followed, but her mind was racing. Who were those men? And what did the Navajo warrior know about them that he wasn't telling her? She had a feeling she wasn't going to get answers anytime soon, but for now, she would have to trust him. He had already saved her once. She could only hope he could protect her again. Amelia followed the Navajo man in silence as they made their way through the woods. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows. Through the trees, the cool evening air bit at her skin, but the tension of their encounter with the riders still held her in its grip. The man moved with the same quiet confidence that he had shown when he had pulled her from the quicksand. Every step was deliberate, every movement measured. Amelia tried to focus on the trail ahead, but her mind was a swirl of questions. Who were those men? What did they want? Why had they come so close to the shelter? And why was the Navajo man so calm? They reached the shelter again, and the man stopped at the entrance. He turned to Amelia, his eyes sharp in the dim light. You stay here. Do not leave this place until I return, he said, his voice low but firm. Amelia opened her mouth to ask where he was going, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know if she was ready to face whatever danger lurked outside, but she knew she had no choice. The man was the only person who had shown her any kind of protection since she arrived in this wild land. She nodded, watching as he disappeared into the trees, his figure swallowed up by the darkness. Alone, Amelia sat by the fire, her mind racing. The crackling of the flames was the only sound, but it seemed too loud in the quiet of the night. She kept her eyes trained on the shadows around her, half expecting the riders to return. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours, and still, there was no sign of the Navajo man. Amelia could feel the cold creeping in, her body shivering despite the fire. The isolation was starting to get to her. She longed for the comfort of civilization, the sounds of people, of safety. But here, in this vast wilderness, there was only uncertainty. What was she doing here? Was this where her life was meant to be? It was a question she had avoided asking herself until now, but the solitude and the danger had brought it to the forefront of her mind. She wasn't sure if she was strong enough to survive this. Just as she was about to slip into the uncomfortable grip of despair, a rustling noise broke the stillness. Her heart skipped a beat, and she stood, her breath catching in her throat. The shadows around her seemed to shift. She stepped closer to the fire, her hand reaching for the knife she had tucked into her belt. The rustling grew louder, then stopped. Amelia's breath quickened, her hand tightening around the knife's hilt. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, from the darkness, the figure of the Navajo man appeared. His eyes caught the firelight as he stepped into the clearing. He held a bow in his hand, and his expression was calm, unreadable. Amelia exhaled in relief, her heart still racing. "You're back," she said, her voice shaky. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he scanned the area, his gaze sweeping across the trees and the ground as if searching for something. "The men are gone," he finally said, his voice steady. "They were looking for you. They will not return tonight." Amelia swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "Who were they?" she asked, the question finally slipping out. The Navajo man didn't immediately answer. Instead, he moved toward the fire, kneeling beside it. "Outlaws," he said simply. "They are looking for something. Someone." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that sent a chill down Amelia's spine. "They wanted me?" she asked, her voice a whisper. He nodded. "You are not the first they have hunted. But you are safe for now." Amelia sat down heavily beside him, her mind racing. Outlaws. It seemed like something out of a storybook, but here, in this wild place, it was all too real. "What do they want?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man paused before speaking again. "They want money, land, power. They are thieves, murderers. They will stop at nothing to get what they want." Amelia felt her heart tighten in her chest. She had been running from one nightmare after another since her life had been turned upside down, and now this. But the man's presence, his quiet strength, gave her a small measure of comfort. She wasn't alone. At least not entirely. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She had to keep moving. The Navajo man stood, his movements fluid and graceful. He reached out a hand to her, helping her to her feet. "Come," he said. "We cannot stay here. We must leave before they return. Amelia nodded, a surge of determination rising within her. She didn't know where they were going, but she knew she had to follow him. She had no choice. He had saved her life once already, and now he was giving her a chance at survival. She took his hand, and together they moved silently into the night. The fire flickered behind them, casting long shadows on the ground. Amelia could feel the weight of the unknown pressing in on her, but with each step, she felt a small glimmer of hope. She was still alive, and as long as she would fight for her future. The Navajo man and Amelia moved silently through the night, the cold air biting at their skin as they made their way deeper into the forest. The darkness seemed to press in on them, but the man's steady presence gave Amelia a sense of security that she hadn't felt in a long time. The rustling of leaves underfoot was the only sound, and the occasional crack of a branch breaking in the distance kept her alert. She tried not to think of the outlaws who had come so close, of the danger that seemed to follow her wherever she went. The man didn't speak as they walked, but Amelia could feel his focus, his sharp awareness of their surroundings. Every so often, he would glance behind them, scanning the path they had left behind. Amelia wanted to ask more questions, to learn more about him, but she knew better than to disturb his concentration. She had no idea where they were going or how long they would be traveling, but for now, she followed him without question. Hours passed, and the fatigue from her earlier ordeal began to settle into her bones. She was hungry, exhausted, and anxious, but there was no time to rest. The man seemed to know exactly where he was going, his steps never faltering. He led her toward a small clearing, and there, hidden among the trees, was a simple structure, a makeshift camp, with a fire burning in the center. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Amelia let out a sigh of relief as they reached it. She hadn't realized how tense she had been until she stepped into the camp and felt the warmth of the fire. The man motioned for her to sit by the fire while he gathered some supplies. Amelia obeyed, feeling the weight of the day settle into her limbs. As she sat there, she couldn't help but watch him. He moved with purpose, every action deliberate. There was something about him, something beyond just his physical presence. He exuded a quiet strength, an energy that seemed to fill the space around him. She had no idea how he had come to be this way, this guardian of the land, but she felt a strange bond forming between them. He was the one who had saved her from the quicksand, the one who had led her into the night, the one who offered her safety in this wilderness. He returned with a small bundle of herbs and a few pieces of dried meat. He handed them to her without a word, and Amelia accepted them gratefully. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was in front of her. She chewed slowly, savoring the small meal. The fire crackled between them, the only sound breaking the silence. She had so many questions, so much she needed to understand about this place, about the man beside her. "Why did you help me?" she asked quietly, her voice almost lost in the crackling of the fire. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sat down across from her, his eyes still fixed on the fire. "Because you needed help," he said at last. His voice was calm, but there was an underlying intensity to it. "And because the land has a way of calling people to where they belong." Amelia frowned, trying to make sense of his words. "Where do I belong?" she asked. The question seemed to hang in the air between them, unanswered. The man didn't look at her, but he spoke again, his voice steady. "That is for you to discover," he said. "The land has a way of showing us our path, even when we don't see it ourselves." Amelia didn't understand what he meant, but somehow, the way he spoke made her feel as though she was part of something bigger. It wasn't just about survival, it was about connection. She was connected to this land, to this man, in a way she hadn't anticipated. She wasn't sure what her next steps were, but for the first time since her life had unraveled, she felt a sense of purpose, a sense of being where she was meant to be. The man broke the silence again, his voice low. "There are things you do not yet understand," he said. "But in time you will." Amelia nodded, unsure of what to say. There was so much she still needed to learn, so much that didn't make sense. But for now, she was safe. For now, she was alive. As the fire burned down to embers, the man rose and began preparing the camp for sleep. He didn't offer any more explanations, didn't provide any further insight into the path ahead. But Amelia understood. She understood that the journey wasn't just about escaping the danger that had followed her from the town. It was about learning to trust, to accept what the land had to offer, and to become a part of it. She lay down on the ground, pulling a blanket around her for warmth. The man settled nearby, but his eyes never left the darkened woods. Amelia drifted off to sleep, her thoughts still racing. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it. The land, in its quiet, unyielding way, had already begun to shape her future. She had no idea where that path would lead, but she knew she wasn't walking it alone. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting long, cool shadows over the camp. Amelia awoke with a start, her body stiff from the hard ground, but there was no immediate panic, no urgent need to escape. The man had kept watch through the night, his presence always calm and unwavering. As she sat up, stretching her arms above her head, she saw him tending to the fire, the smoke rising in thin, lazy curls into the crisp air. The scent of the burning wood mixed with the fresh, earthy smell of the forest. She didn't know what to expect today, but she knew one thing: things were changing. The quiet rhythm of the land had begun to seep into her, and although the past still lingered in the back of her mind, the weight of it didn't feel as suffocating as it once had. She looked up at the man, who seemed unaware of her watching him. He moved with the same quiet grace as always, his motions fluid and controlled. He wasn't just a protector, there was something deeper about him. He had become a part of the landscape itself, an embodiment of the wilderness. She had never met someone like him, and yet, she couldn't help but feel that there was much more to his story than he had let on. "We need to move," he said suddenly, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "The outlaws will not stop." Amelia blinked, surprised by the suddenness of the statement. "But, you said they were gone." He nodded, his eyes scanning the trees as if searching for something. "For now, but there will be more." Amelia felt a tight knot form in her stomach. She had known this wouldn't be easy, but hearing it from him made the reality more daunting. She wasn't sure where they would go or what she would do, but she knew she couldn't stay here. The man was right. Staying in one place for too long would only make them easier to find. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice shaky. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he began gathering his things, moving quickly and methodically, as if preparing for a journey he had taken 1,000 times before. Amelia followed his lead, her hands moving on their own as she packed her small belongings. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to steady her thoughts. She had no idea what lay ahead, but the fear that had once paralyzed her seemed to fade into the background. With every moment that passed, she felt a sense of clarity, of purpose that she hadn't felt in months. They were no longer running from danger. They were moving towards something, though Amelia didn't know exactly what. "I know a place," the man said, his voice low. "A safe place." Safe. The word hung in the air between them, but Amelia couldn't help the feeling of skepticism that crept into her mind. She had heard the word safe before, but it had never meant much. In her world, safety was a fleeting illusion. But in the quiet confidence of the man's words, she sensed something different. He wasn't offering her a false promise. He truly believed that this place could offer her safety. She had no choice but to trust him. They set out through the woods, the air still cool with the remnants of the night, and the path beneath their feet was soft, almost too quiet. Amelia's mind kept racing. Where was this place? What would they find there? She had so many questions, but she didn't dare ask. The man didn't talk much, and even when he did, his words were deliberate, not meant to fill the silence, but to make every word count. She respected that about him. They walked for hours, the dense forest slowly giving way to a more open area. The trees grew sparse, and Amelia could see the sky stretching out ahead, the sunlight breaking through the branches in beams of golden light. She felt the warmth on her skin, the calm of the place slowly soaking into her bones. The man moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the horizon. Amelia followed closely, her steps lighter now. The weight in her chest had begun to lift, replaced with something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As they moved forward, the man stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the land before them. Amelia followed his gaze and saw a small structure in the distance, tucked between the trees. It was simple, rustic, nothing like the town she had known, but it had a certain charm to it. This, she realized, was their destination. They walked toward it, and as they got closer, she saw that it wasn't just a shelter. It was a home. The man stopped at the entrance, his posture changing slightly, as if he were preparing for something. Amelia stood behind him, feeling the quiet tension in the air. The man turned to her, his expression unreadable. "This is where you will be safe," he said. She nodded, feeling a lump rise in her throat. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a place in this world. She stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the shelter, and as she did, the door closed behind her. It wasn't the end of her journey, but it was a beginning. The beginning of something new. The following morning, Amelia woke to the sound of birds calling in the distance. The sun was barely rising, casting soft, golden light through the cracks in the shelter. The air was crisp and clean, the scent of pine and fresh earth filling her lungs. She stretched, feeling the pull of the previous day's journey in her muscles. But there was something else, something different about today. She felt a strange sense of peace. The fear that had gripped her for so long seemed to have loosened its hold. She had been given a second chance, and for the first time in what felt like ages, she was able to breathe. The Navajo man had already risen. He was standing outside the shelter, his figure silhouetted against the early morning light as he surveyed the land around them. Amelia watched him from the doorway, noticing how at ease he seemed, as if the wilderness was his home, and had always been. She wanted to ask him more questions, to learn about his past, his journey, but the thought seemed to fade as she stepped outside and approached him. His eyes flicked to her as she approached, his expression unreadable. "We leave today," he said, his voice steady. "You are safe here, but this place will not stay hidden forever." Amelia felt a pang of uncertainty. She had just begun to feel a semblance of peace, and now they were leaving. She didn't want to ask why, but she knew that there was no point in questioning his decision. He had been right before, and she needed to trust him if she had any hope of survival. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. He turned, motioning for her to follow. "There is a place further north. It will be harder to reach, but it is safer." Amelia nodded. She didn't need more explanation. She trusted him. At least, she had no reason not to. The two of them gathered their things in silence. The shelter had been modest, but it had provided her with a sense of security she hadn't realized she was missing. The warmth of the fire, the solitude of the forest, all of it had felt like a temporary refuge. But now, it was time to move on. As they walked, Amelia found herself asking the same question again and again in her mind. Why had he saved her? She had never asked him directly, but she couldn't stop wondering. What had drawn him to her? To risk everything to protect her? She had been a stranger in his land, someone who had no place here. Yet, he had taken her in, and for reasons unknown, he seemed intent on keeping her safe. She glanced at him, but he was focused ahead, his eyes scanning their surroundings. "Do you have a family?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. The question was simple, but it carried so much weight. The man did not answer right away. For a long moment, he remained quiet, and Amelia began to feel the tension of the moment. She had asked the wrong question, something personal, something that he didn't want to share. But then he spoke. "I have no family. Not in the way you mean." His voice was steady, but there was a hint of something deeper in his words. "I belong to the land." Amelia nodded slowly. She understood, or at least, she thought she did. It wasn't the answer she had expected, but somehow it made sense. He wasn't bound by the same rules that the rest of the world followed. His connection to the earth, to the wilderness, was stronger than anything that could be formed by blood or tradition. She wondered if that was the reason he had helped her, because the land had called to him to do so. They continued their journey, walking in silence, with only the sound of the forest around them. The woods were thick, the trees towering above them, and Amelia felt small in the vastness of it all. The man moved with confidence, his steps sure and deliberate. She tried to keep up, but her legs were sore from the previous day's travels. Still, she didn't complain. She had learned that complaining wouldn't get her anywhere. It wouldn't help her survive. Hours passed, and the further they traveled, the more the terrain seemed to change. The forest gave way to hills, the trees thinning as they climbed higher. Amelia's legs burned with the effort, but she pushed on. The landscape was beautiful in its way. The sun shone through the branches, casting dappled light on the ground, and the air was fresh and cool. The man didn't stop. He led her onward, never looking back, as if he were leading them to something. Amelia didn't know what lay ahead, but she kept following. And for the first time since she had arrived in this wild place, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could make it. As the day wore on, they reached the crest of a hill. The man stopped and turned to her, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We are close," he said. Amelia followed his gaze and saw what he meant. In the distance, nestled in the valley below, was a small settlement. It was nothing like the bustling town she had known, but it was a place that seemed to hold promise. She couldn't see clearly from this distance, but it looked like a place where people lived, where they might be safe. She felt a flicker of hope rise within her. "Is that where we're going?" she asked, her voice full of uncertainty. The man nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile crossing his lips. "Yes, there you will find safety." As they descended the hill, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, the place where everything would change. She didn't know how or when, but she knew that this was the moment when her past would meet her future, and she was ready to face it, whatever it held. The small settlement below them came into view as they made their way down the hill. Amelia could feel the excitement building in her chest, but there was also an edge of uncertainty that refused to let go. What would they find there? Would it really be safe? The Navajo man walked ahead of her, his steady pace not slowing even as the path became steeper. She followed, keeping her eyes on his back, trusting him as she had since they first met. The journey had been long, and though she had begun to feel a sense of peace, the weight of her past still hung heavily on her. But this place, whatever it was, offered something new, something she couldn't turn away from. The closer they got, the more details emerged. The settlement was small, no more than a few dozen buildings scattered among the trees, with smoke rising from a couple of chimneys. It looked peaceful, almost too peaceful, and it reminded her of the small farms she had seen in the past, places where people worked the land and lived simple lives. She couldn't help but wonder how such a place had remained hidden from the chaos of the outside world. As they approached the settlement, the Navajo man slowed, his eyes scanning the area. He was cautious, as if expecting trouble, but Amelia couldn't see anything that seemed out of place. The place looked deserted, but there were signs of life, footprints in the dirt, a horse grazing nearby, and the faint smell of food cooking. "We are close," the man said, his voice low but clear. He didn't look at her, but Amelia could sense his heightened alertness. She didn't question him. Instead, she followed his lead, moving cautiously, her eyes flicking to the buildings around them. They reached the edge of the settlement, and the man turned to her. "Stay close," he instructed. "Do not speak unless necessary. This place is not for outsiders." Amelia nodded, feeling a tightness in her chest. She had no idea what he meant, but she could tell by his tone that this was serious. She kept her mouth shut and stayed close, her feet quiet on the ground as they moved deeper into the settlement. They passed a few simple houses, log cabins with thatched roofs, some of them with small gardens in front. Amelia could hear the faint murmur of voices, but there was no one in sight. It felt as though they were walking through a ghost town, yet the sound of life was still present. The Navajo man led her to a small building at the far end of the settlement, its door open and a faint light spilling out. He paused before entering, his gaze shifting toward the trees behind them, as if ensuring they weren't being followed. After a long moment, he stepped inside. Amelia hesitated but followed him, her heart pounding. Inside, the room was simple but welcoming. A fire burned in the hearth, filling the room with warmth. There were shelves lining the walls, filled with various items, dried herbs, tools, and bundles of cloth. In the center of the room stood a large wooden table, and behind it sat an older man with silver hair, his face weathered by years in the sun. He looked up as they entered, his eyes sharp, assessing. The Navajo man spoke first. "She is safe here," he said, his voice steady. The older man nodded, his gaze flicking to Amelia. He didn't smile, but there was a sense of recognition in his eyes. "So it seems," he replied in a deep, gravelly voice. He studied Amelia for a moment longer before speaking again. "You are welcome here, but understand this. There are no guarantees. The land may offer safety, but the world outside does not." Amelia swallowed hard. The weight of his words sank in. She had hoped for a place of refuge, a chance to start over. but she realized that safety wasn't as simple as it seemed. There was always danger lurking, even in the quietest of places. "Thank you," she said, her voice small. "I understand." The older man nodded once more. "Rest here tonight. You will leave at first light. It is not safe to stay long." The Navajo man didn't speak, but his presence was reassuring, like a constant shadow, protecting her from whatever came next. Amelia didn't know what would happen after that. She had been running for so long, her life a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty. But this place, this strange settlement, offered something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging. She couldn't explain it, but it was there, in the air, in the way the Navajo man had protected her, in the way the older man had welcomed her. For the first time in months, Amelia allowed herself to breathe, to think of something other than survival. She sat by the fire, her thoughts quieting as the warmth wrapped around her. The flames crackled softly, and the scent of wood smoke filled the room, grounding her. This was a moment of peace, fleeting as it may be. For now it was enough. She was safe, at least for tonight. And that was all she could ask for. The man and the older man spoke in quiet tones as the fire burned low, their conversation unintelligible to Amelia, but she didn't mind. She felt like an outsider here, and she had no intention of intruding. Instead, she settled back, her eyes drifting closed as exhaustion took over. The journey had been long, and though she wasn't sure what the next day would bring, she knew she was no longer alone. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was no longer a path she had to walk alone. The morning came quickly, the light spilling into the room through the small cracks in the walls of the shelter. Amelia woke with a start, the remnants of a restless sleep still clinging to her. The fire from the night before had burned down to embers, and the warmth that had been comforting was now just a memory. She rubbed her eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion in her limbs. The sound of quiet voices reached her ears, and she could hear the faint crackle of the fire being stoked. The Navajo man and the older man were speaking in low tones, their words indistinguishable. Amelia sat up, stretching her sore muscles. She was used to the discomfort of travel, but the fatigue from the journey was starting to settle in. She had no idea what the day would bring, but she knew it was time to move on. She couldn't afford to stay in one place too long. Not with the outlaws still out there, hunting her. She rose to her feet, her eyes flicking toward the doorway. She saw the Navajo man, standing just outside, his posture calm but alert. He seemed as though he had never left the land, as if he had always been a part of it. His eyes flicked to her, and he nodded. Without a word, he turned and began to pack his things. Amelia followed his lead, gathering her belongings in silence. She didn't want to ask questions, not yet. She needed to stay focused. The older man appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He nodded at Amelia, and then his gaze shifted to the Navajo man. "You are ready?" he asked. The Navajo man nodded. "We leave at first light. We head north." The older man's eyes narrowed. "The journey will be difficult. The land is not kind in the north." Amelia felt a chill at his words. She didn't know what lay ahead, but something in the older man's tone made her uneasy. "We will be fine," the Navajo man said, his voice steady. "The land will guide us." The older man didn't speak again, but he seemed to accept the answer. He turned and disappeared back into the shelter, leaving Amelia and the Navajo man alone. Amelia gathered the last of her things and stepped outside, her breath visible in the cool morning air. The landscape around her was vast and wild, the trees stretching out in every direction. She could feel the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, the steady rhythm that had been there all along. She glanced at the man beside her, wondering what lay ahead, but she didn't ask. She trusted him, for reasons she couldn't explain. The journey north would not be easy, but she was no longer running from something. She was moving toward something, and that gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't had before. As they made their way through the trees, the air grew colder. The land was shifting, and Amelia could feel the change in the atmosphere. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of anticipation, as though something was about to happen. The Navajo man moved with his usual grace, his eyes scanning the land around them. They walked in silence, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves beneath their feet. Amelia's mind began to wander, but she quickly refocused. She couldn't afford to get distracted. The past few days had felt like a blur, but now, As they moved further into the wilderness, the reality of their situation began to set in. They were heading into unknown territory, where dangers could lurk around every corner. But despite the uncertainty, Amelia felt a sense of determination building within her. The land was different here. It was older, more ancient, and it felt like it was speaking to her, in a way that was hard to understand but undeniable. As they continued their journey, the trees grew thicker, their branches twisting and reaching like gnarled fingers. The forest felt alive, but not in the way Amelia was used to. It was as though the land itself was watching them, waiting for something to unfold. The man beside her moved with quiet confidence, his eyes never leaving the path ahead. She followed, not questioning, simply trusting. They walked for hours, the day stretching out before them. The sky above was a dull gray, the sun hidden behind thick clouds. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves and making the trees sway. The air was sharp, and the ground beneath them had become uneven, the path harder to navigate. Amelia's legs were beginning to ache, but she pushed on. She knew they couldn't stop. The man had said they would leave at first light, and they were following the path laid before them. Finally, they reached a small clearing. It was quiet here, the wind slowing to a gentle breeze, the trees opening up to reveal a wide stretch of land. In the distance, Amelia could see the faint outline of mountains, their peaks hidden behind a veil of mist. The man stopped, turning to her. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, and for the first time, he seemed uncertain. Amelia opened her mouth to ask what was wrong, but the words died on her lips as he held up his hand, signaling for her to stay silent. She listened, straining her ears to catch any sound. It was then that she heard it. A faint rustling, distant but unmistakable. The sound of movement in the trees. The outlaws had found them. The Navajo man turned to her, his face hardening. "Stay close," he said. "Do not move unless I tell you." Amelia's heart raced as she took a step back, her eyes darting to the trees. She felt the weight of their situation press in on her. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. And yet, despite the fear, there was something else, a quiet, fierce resolve. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her now. The rustling grew louder, and the man tensed, his hand going to the hilt of his knife. Amelia swallowed hard. They had no choice but to face what was coming. She only hoped they were ready. The rustling grew louder, and Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. She instinctively took a step closer to the Navajo man, her eyes scanning the trees, her breath shallow. The wind had picked up again, swirling the dry leaves around their feet, but there was no mistaking the sound of movement ahead. She knew the outlaws were near, but she couldn't see them, yet. The man beside her was still, his body tense as he crouched low to the ground. His sharp eyes, however, never left the path ahead. Amelia swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves, but her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly. She had never been this close to danger. She had always heard the stories of outlaws, of lawlessness, of people who took what they wanted without fear of consequence. But now, she was living it. She glanced over at the man, his stoic demeanor giving her a strange sense of calm. He had protected her before, and now she had to trust him to do it again. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rustling of the leaves. Amelia nodded, barely able to make a sound. Her mind raced as she tried to think. Of their options, they couldn't outrun the outlaws, she knew that much. The forest was dense, but it also had its limits. The outlaws were skilled, and they would track them down if they tried to run. The Navajo man's eyes flicked toward her, a silent command to stay close. Then, in one swift motion, he pulled his knife from its sheath. It gleamed in the dim light, the steel as sharp as his focus. He moved with precision, each step calculated, as though he had rehearsed this 1,000 times. Amelia followed as best as she could, her every step tentative but steady. The man moved toward a cluster of trees, crouching low behind the thick trunks. He gestured for Amelia to join him, and she did, taking refuge in the shadows. The wind howled again, masking the sound of their movements. She held her breath, waiting, straining her ears to catch any hint of what was coming. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. The rustling grew louder and more distinct, now accompanied by hushed voices. Amelia's heart skipped a beat as she realized the outlaws were close, too close. "They're right there," the Navajo man muttered, his voice low and steady. Stay down. Amelia crouched lower, her body pressed against the cold earth, the dampness seeping through her clothes. She couldn't see the outlaws yet, but she could hear their voices now, low, gruff, and filled with the harshness of men used to getting their way. We're getting close. I can smell them, one of the men said. The trail's fresh. They can't have gone far. Amelia's stomach tightened. She wanted to run, to flee, but she stayed still, knowing it would be too late. She had no choice but to trust the Navajo man. We have to move, he said quietly. Stay low and follow me. The urgency in his voice was enough to snap Amelia out of her paralyzing fear. She nodded, taking one last look at the approaching figures before slipping behind him. They moved through the forest with practiced ease, the Navajo man leading the way, his movements fluid and swift. Amelia followed close behind, every muscle in her body tensed, her mind racing. The trees seemed to close in around them as they moved, the underbrush thick and unforgiving. But the Navajo man seemed to know exactly where to step, his body always a few steps ahead, guiding her through the wilderness. They reached a small ravine, and the man stopped, motioning for Amelia to stay quiet. The outlaws were getting closer, and they had to be careful. We'll cross here, he whispered, pointing toward a narrow ledge that ran along the edge of the ravine. It wasn't an ideal escape route, but it was their only option. Amelia nodded, her heart racing as she carefully made her way toward the ledge. The man moved in front of her, his eyes scanning the terrain for any sign of danger. They crossed the ledge quickly, making their way down into the ravine. The sound of the outlaws' voices grew louder, but the man held them back, moving cautiously. Amelia could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her. There was no room for error. One wrong move, and they would be trapped. Once they were safely across, the Navajo man glanced up the ravine, his expression unreadable. We need to get to higher ground, he said. It's the only way we'll be able to see them before they see us. Amelia nodded again, following his lead as they scrambled up the rocky slope. The climb was difficult, the loose stones slipping beneath her feet, but she kept her focus. They couldn't afford to stop, not now. When they reached the top, they paused, crouching behind a large rock, hidden from view. The outlaws were now within sight, moving through the trees, their horses kicking up dust as they searched for their prey. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. The men were armed, their eyes scanning the forest with dangerous intent. She could see them clearly now, for men, each wearing weathered clothes and scowls that spoke of hardened lives. They were relentless. The Navajo man's grip on his knife tightened, and Amelia felt a knot form in her stomach. This was it. She had never been so close to danger, and the reality of the moment hit her hard. But the man beside her didn't flinch. He was calm, focused, waiting for the right moment. Amelia could only hope that they would be able to slip away without being seen. The wind shifted again, rustling the trees, and the outlaws paused. Amelia held her breath, her body frozen. She could feel the man beside her tense, but he remained motionless. It was a standoff, but Amelia couldn't tell. Who would win? Would they make it out alive? Or would the outlaws catch up to them before they could escape? The wind shifted once more, sending a gust of air that stirred the leaves and masked the sound of the outlaws' movements. The Navajo man's eyes narrowed, his body tensing as he focused on the four figures ahead. They were close, too close for comfort, but the outlaws still hadn't spotted them. Amelia's heart thudded in her chest, her breath shallow, as the weight of the situation settled over her. Every muscle in her body was poised to move, yet she couldn't shake the feeling of being caught in a trap. The Navajo man remained still, his gaze locked on the approaching riders, calculating their movements. Amelia's mind raced. They needed a way out. They couldn't stay hidden forever, and they couldn't risk being caught by the outlaws. The man beside her was the only thing standing between her and danger. He was her protector, but she could sense that the danger was closing in on them, and there would soon be no way to avoid it. As the outlaws drew nearer, the Navajo man shifted slightly, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, ready. He was preparing to fight, to defend them both if it came to that. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as she realized the gravity of the moment. She had never imagined that her life would come down to this. A standoff in the wilderness with four ruthless men determined to find her. The leader of the outlaws, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, spoke in a low voice. His words carried on the wind. "I know they passed through here," he said, his voice rough. "They can't have gone far. Spread out. Find them." The outlaws disbanded, spreading out in different directions, their eyes scanning the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Amelia held her breath, praying they wouldn't find them. The Navajo man's grip tightened on his knife, his body poised to spring into action. He wasn't just waiting to fight. He was waiting for the right moment. Amelia watched him, sensing his calmness, his unshakable focus. She could feel his determination, and it steadied her own nerves. But there was still fear within her. Fear of being found, of being dragged back into the chaos she had been running from. The outlaws were getting closer, moving along the ravine, but they hadn't spotted them yet. Amelia's heart raced as she realized just how dangerous this was. She had no way to defend herself. It was up to the Navajo man to protect them both. The sound of boots crunching the dry leaves echoed in the stillness, and for a moment, it seemed as though time itself had slowed. The leader of the outlaws was now only a few feet away, his eyes scanning the area. He was dangerously close, and Amelia held her breath, praying that the man's careful movements would be enough to keep them hidden. The man beside her didn't flinch. He was still as a stone, his eyes fixed on the outlaws, waiting for their next move. The wind shifted again, blowing through the trees, and in that moment, the outlaws were distracted. They stopped, looking at each other with confusion, their attention briefly diverted. The Navajo man seized the opportunity. Without a sound, he moved, pulling Amelia with him as he rose from behind the rock. They sprinted across the ravine, their feet pounding the ground as they raced for cover. The outlaws heard the movement, but it was too late. The Navajo man had already moved them out of the line of sight. The chase was on. Amelia's lungs burned as she ran, but she didn't dare look back. She could hear the outlaws shouting, their heavy footsteps crashing behind them. They were closing in, but the Navajo man kept his pace steady, guiding her through the dense underbrush, never losing his focus. They climbed over rocks and through thickets, their path unpredictable, but the man knew where to go. He was leading them to safety, or at least, that's what Amelia hoped. She pushed herself harder, her legs aching, but she couldn't stop. Not now. The sound of pursuit grew louder, but so did the pounding of her own heartbeat. They weren't far behind. The Navajo man glanced over his shoulder, and Amelia saw a flash of determination in his eyes. He wasn't going to let them catch them, not while he had breath in his body. They reached the edge of a small stream, the sound of rushing water filling the air. The Navajo man stopped abruptly, pulling Amelia to the side. They crouched low, staying close to the earth, their bodies hidden by the thick foliage. The outlaws were almost upon them, their voices now clearly audible. "They must have crossed here," the leader of the outlaws said, his voice tight with frustration. "Find them. They can't be far." Amelia's breath hitched in her throat as the outlaws stopped near the water, their voices just yards away. She could hear their boots crunching the leaves, their heavy breathing, but the Navajo man didn't move. He stayed still, waiting for them to pass. Every second felt like an eternity. The outlaws paused, as if uncertain of where to go next. Amelia could feel the tension in the air, the silence thick between them. It seemed as though the whole forest held its breath, and just when Amelia thought the worst was over, one of the outlaws shouted, "I see them. They're over here." The chase was on again, but this time, the Navajo man was ready. Without a word, he grabbed Amelia's hand and pulled her forward, away from the stream, back into the trees. The outlaws were too close. The final sprint had begun. The chase continued, faster now, the air growing thicker with each passing second. The outlaws were closing in, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush behind them. Amelia's heart raced, the weight of fear pressing down on her chest as she pushed herself harder, trying to keep pace with the Navajo man. His grip on her hand was firm, his steps sure and steady, but Amelia's legs burned from the effort. They had no time to stop. The outlaws were relentless, their voices growing louder as they tracked their every move. "Don't let them get away," one of the outlaws shouted. Amelia's breath was shallow, the panic rising in her throat. She could hear them getting closer, too close. "We can't outrun them forever," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The Navajo man didn't look at her, but his expression was set, his eyes focused on the path ahead. "We won't outrun them. "We will fight," he said simply, his voice calm. Amelia felt a jolt of fear shoot through her. Fight. She wasn't prepared for that. She didn't know how to fight. Her only weapon was her fear, and she wasn't sure it would be enough. But there was no time to question him now. The forest seemed to close in. Around them, the trees growing denser, their branches reaching like claws. The Navajo man pulled her to the side, leading her off the main path and into a thicket of dense underbrush. She barely had time to register the change in direction before they were crouching low, hidden beneath the cover of the thick foliage. She could hear the outlaws now, just yards away, their voices growing more frantic as they searched for them. "They've got to be close," one of them barked. "I'll take the left. You check the right." The men split up, their footsteps echoing through the trees. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She could hear them moving closer. She could see their figures now, moving through the trees like shadows. The Navajo man didn't flinch. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. Amelia's heart was in her throat, and all she could do was hold her breath. The outlaws were so close now she could see the dirt on their boots, the hard lines on their faces. One of the men stopped, his eyes scanning the underbrush. Amelia could feel his gaze pass over her, her stomach tightening with the fear that they had been seen. But the man didn't stop. He moved on, following his comrades. The Navajo man waited, his body completely still. Amelia could barely move, her whole body locked in place. She didn't dare make a sound. They waited for what felt like an eternity, the men moving past them, unaware that they were so close. Then, when the sound of footsteps faded, the Navajo man made his move. "Stay low and follow," he whispered. He moved silently through the underbrush, guiding her through the dense woods, always staying ahead. Amelia kept close behind him, her body moving on instinct now. The fear still gnawed at her, but there was something else now. Something sharper, something that urged her to keep going. They moved swiftly, each step calculated, each movement purposeful. The Navajo man's eyes never left the path ahead, his focus unwavering. Amelia could feel her own focus sharpen, her mind pushing aside the panic, centering on the only thing that mattered, survival. They reached a small creek, the sound of water rushing over rocks filling the air. The Navajo man crouched, his fingers brushing the surface of the water, testing it. "Cross here," he said, his voice quiet. The water was cold, the current fast, but they didn't have time to find another way. They stepped into the creek, the water rising quickly to their knees, the current pushing against them. Amelia stumbled, her feet slipping on the slippery rocks beneath the surface. The Navajo man steadied her, his grip firm as he helped her across. "Stay focused," he said. They made it to the other side, the sound of the outlaws' voices fading behind them. But Amelia could feel the tension in the air. They weren't safe yet. "Keep moving," the Navajo man said, his voice still calm, still steady. They pushed forward, moving further into the woods, leaving the creek behind. The trees grew thicker here, the underbrush denser, but the path was clear. The Navajo man's movements were precise, his steps sure. Amelia followed, her breath heavy, but she kept her focus on him, trusting him completely. They walked for what felt like hours, the sounds of the forest around them muted in the stillness. Amelia couldn't help but wonder how far they had gone, how far they needed to go before they could stop, before they could rest. She wanted to ask, but she didn't. She didn't need to. The Navajo man knew. He always knew. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the trees began to thin, and the sky above them opened up. The first light of dawn was breaking, casting a pale glow over the landscape. The Navajo man stopped, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We are close," he said. Amelia's heart surged with hope. She had no idea where they were going, but she trusted him. She had to. The man led her forward, and as they moved, the sun rose higher, its light warming the earth beneath their feet. The world seemed to come alive around them, the air fresh and clean. Amelia couldn't help but feel a sense of calm wash over her. She was alive, and she was with him. Together, they would survive. As they moved further into the wilderness, the landscape began to change. The dense forest opened up to reveal a vast expanse of rolling hills, the grass swaying gently in the early morning breeze. Amelia felt a shift in the air, a stillness that was different from the tension they had left behind. She had no idea how far they had traveled or where they were headed, but for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a sense of peace in the air. The outlaws were behind them, and though she knew it wasn't over, she allowed herself a brief moment to breathe. The Navajo man, ever the silent guardian, led her through the open expanse, his pace steady and purposeful. Amelia followed, her steps lighter now, though the weariness still clung to her body. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. She trusted him. After what felt like hours, they reached the crest of a hill. The land before them stretched out in a seemingly endless sea of green and gold. The sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows across the land. For a moment, they both stood there, taking in the view. Amelia felt the weight of the journey settle on her, but it wasn't the same crushing feeling it had once been. This time, she felt something else, something that made her chest swell with hope. "We're almost there," the Navajo man said, his voice low, but there was a hint of something in it that Amelia couldn't place. Relief, perhaps? "Where?" she asked, her voice small. "You will see soon," he replied. His voice was steady, but there was an underlying promise in his words. Amelia nodded, trusting him without question. They continued on, walking side by side, the wind picking up as they descended toward the valley below. The air felt different here, fresher, cleaner. She could almost taste the change. As they neared the bottom of the hill, a small structure came into view, nothing more than a simple dwelling, nestled in the heart of the valley. It was small, built from wood and stone, with a thatched roof and a stone chimney. It looked peaceful, almost hidden, as if it had grown out of the earth itself. The Navajo man walked toward it, his steps deliberate. Amelia followed, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what to expect, but she felt a strange calm settle over her as they reached the doorstep. The man turned to her, his eyes steady and calm. "This is where you will be safe," he said. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. Safe. The word had seemed so distant to her, like a dream, a memory of something long past. But now, standing here at the threshold of this small home, it felt real. She didn't know what had drawn her to this place, or what had driven her to follow him all this way, but she knew this was where she was meant to be. She had survived the dangers of the past, the uncertainty, the fear. And now, here, she was offered something more than just safety. She was offered a chance to live again. The man pushed the door open, revealing a warm, dimly lit interior. There was a fire burning in the hearth, its glow flickering on the stone walls. A small table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by chairs. Simple, but it felt like home. Amelia stepped inside, the warmth from the fire wrapping around her like a blanket. She closed the door behind her, and for the first time in what felt like years, she allowed herself to truly relax. She had made it. She was safe. The Navajo man stepped inside after her, closing the door gently behind him. He glanced at her once before moving to the fire. "Rest," he said, his voice still low, but there was a softness to it now. "You've earned it." Amelia nodded, her eyes drifting to the fire. She had earned it, but she knew the journey wasn't over. Not yet. The world outside was still dangerous, still uncertain. But for now, she had a place to rest, a place to gather her strength. And that was enough. She sank into one of the chairs by the fire, feeling the warmth seep into her bones. The Navajo man watched her for a moment, then turned to the fire, adding more wood to the flames. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding. There was no need for words now. The danger had passed for the moment. She was safe here. Amelia closed her eyes, her mind drifting. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for now, she was alive. And that, she thought, was more than enough. As the fire crackled softly, she let the warmth of the room wash over her, her body relaxing for the first time in days. The world outside might still be a place of danger and uncertainty, but here, in this small, peaceful home, she could finally rest. And that was enough. For now, it was enough. In this captivating journey through the wilds of the American frontier, Amelia's story unfolds in true Western stories fashion. A tale of survival, unexpected alliances, and the unyielding force of nature. This story immerses you in a world where danger lurks around every corner, and courage is the only weapon that can truly protect you. As she navigates through the unforgiving wilderness, Amelia encounters relentless outlaws, a mysterious Navajo protector, and a life-altering journey that brings her closer to discovering her place in this vast, untamed land. Each chapter of this narrative draws you deeper into the essence of Western stories, where survival and human strength are tested beyond measure. From tense standoffs to the peaceful refuge of a hidden settlement, Amelia's path unfolds like the very land she's learning to trust. Whether she's running from dangerous men or finding solace in the quiet of the wilderness, this tale embodies the spirit of Western stories, filled with moments of heart-stopping suspense and quiet reflection. Experience the raw, untamed beauty of the frontier through Amelia's eyes, where every decision could be her last. If you're a fan of Western stories, this is a journey you won't want to miss. The blend of harsh realities and deep introspection makes it a truly immersive experience that captures the very essence of what makes Western stories unforgettable.